The bright morning sun streamed through the windows of room 203 at Roosevelt High School, where Ms. Karen Thompson's advanced English class was in full swing. The veteran teacher of 15 years stood at the front of the classroom, her gray streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun, as she lectured about Shakespeare's Macbeth. Her voice carried its usual tone of authority, but today there was an edge to it that her students noticed. Jasmine Williams sat in the third row, trying her best to focus on the lesson. The 17-year-old honor student was known for her perfect attendance and stellar grades, but today her mind kept drifting to her grandmother, who had been admitted to the hospital the previous night. Her phone, set to silent mode and tucked halfway under her textbook, buzzed softly with an incoming message. The classroom was warm and stuffy, filled with the soft scratching of pencils as 28 students took notes. Most of them were already counting down the minutes until lunch break. Marcus, who sat next to Jasmine, noticed her quick glance at her phone but said nothing. He knew she wasn't the type to break rules without good reason. When Jasmine saw her mother's name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. With trembling fingers, she carefully slid the phone out just enough to read the message. "Grandma's condition has changed. Doctor wants to talk to us." The words made her stomach twist with worry. Miss Thompson, who had been writing on the whiteboard, turned around at that exact moment. Her sharp eyes, magnified behind thick-rimmed glasses, caught the faint blue glow of Jasmine's phone screen. The marker in her hand dropped to her desk with a sharp clatter. Well, Miss Thompson's voice cut through the classroom silence like a knife. Her sensible shoes clicked against the linoleum floor as she moved between the rows of desks. "What do we have here, Miss Williams?" Jasmine looked up, her dark eyes wide with concern. "Miss Thompson, I'm sorry. It's just that my grandmother is in the hospital, and—" "I don't care if the president himself is texting you," Miss Thompson interrupted, her face flushing red. "The rules about phones in my classroom are very clear." She stood over Jasmine's desk now, casting a shadow across the young student's textbook. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had seen Miss Thompson get strict before, but something felt different this time. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Please," Jasmine began again, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's my mom texting about my grandmother's condition. I can show you." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Miss Thompson's hand shot out like a snake striking its prey. Her fingers wrapped around Jasmine's phone, yanking it away with such force that Jasmine's textbook tumbled to the floor. Before anyone could react, Miss Thompson raised the phone above her head. "This is what happens when you break my rules," she shouted, and with a sudden violent motion, she threw the phone against the wall near the classroom door. The sound of plastic and glass shattering echoed through the stunned silence. Pieces of the phone scattered across the floor like broken stars. The protective case, a birthday gift from Jasmine's little sister, split in two. The screen, now a web of cracks, gave one final flicker before going dark. The classroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. In the back row, Tanya Chen had her own phone out, secretly recording everything. Other students exchanged shocked glances, some pulling out their phones under their desks to text what they had just witnessed. Jasmine sat frozen in her chair, her hands gripping the edges of her desk so tight her knuckles turned white. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. The crushing silence that followed was broken only by Miss Thompson's heavy breathing and the subtle sounds of phone cameras clicking. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," Miss Thompson declared, smoothing down her blouse as if nothing unusual had happened. Her voice had returned to its normal teaching tone, but her hands were shaking. "In my classroom, we focus on learning, not on our phones." The bell rang 5 minutes later, but nobody moved. They all watched as Jasmine slowly got up from her desk, walked to the front of the room, and began picking up the pieces of her destroyed phone. Her movements were deliberate and calm, even as tears finally slipped down her cheeks. As she gathered the last pieces, Jasmine looked up at Miss Thompson, who had already turned back to the whiteboard, as if nothing had happened. In that moment, something changed in Jasmine's eyes, a spark of determination replacing the hurt. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The news of what happened in room 203 spread through Roosevelt High School like wildfire. By the time the lunch period started, Tanya Chen's video had already made its way through dozens of student group chats. The cafeteria buzzed with shocked conversations and angry whispers about Miss Thompson's actions. Jasmine sat alone at a corner table, the broken pieces of her phone laid out before her like a painful puzzle. Her best friend Maria rushed over, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Girl, this is crazy. Have you called your mom yet?" "I can't," Jasmine replied quietly, picking up the shattered screen. "The phone's completely dead, and my mom's probably worried sick because I haven't responded to her message about Grandma." Her voice cracked slightly at the end. Marcus, who had witnessed everything from the next desk, approached their table with his phone held out. "Here, use mine to call your mom, and by the way, I recorded everything too. Miss Thompson didn't see me, but I got it all." With trembling fingers, Jasmine dialed her mother's number. Mrs. Williams answered on the first ring, her voice filled with concern. "Jasmine, why aren't you answering your phone? The doctor says Grandma needs surgery." Taking a deep breath, Jasmine explained what had happened. The cafeteria grew quieter as students nearby listened to her side of the conversation. "Mom, Miss Thompson, she threw my phone against the wall. She destroyed it completely when I tried to check your message about Grandma." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Mrs. Williams spoke again, her voice was eerily calm. "She did what?" Several students who knew Mrs. Williams, a well-respected civil rights attorney, exchanged knowing looks. They recognized that tone. It was the same one she used in court before destroying her opponents. "Stay right there, baby," Mrs. Williams said firmly. "I'm coming to the school now." Word of Mrs. Williams' impending arrival spread quickly through the school halls. By fifth period, even the teachers were talking about it in hushed tones in the break room. Miss Thompson, who had been avoiding the cafeteria and teacher's lounge, sat alone in her classroom grading papers as if nothing unusual had happened. Principal Davis, a man known for avoiding confrontation, paced nervously in his office. The school secretary had already received 12 angry phone calls from parents who had seen the video. Local news stations were calling too, asking for comments about the incident. When Mrs. Williams walked into the school building at 1:45 p.m., the hallways fell silent. She moved with purpose, her heels clicking against the floor, designer briefcase in hand. Behind her walked Mr. Williams, a tall man whose usual friendly smile was replaced by a stern expression. Students pressed against their lockers to let them pass, many pulling out phones to record this moment too. Everyone knew this wasn't just about a broken phone anymore. This was about dignity, respect, and justice. In the main office, Jasmine sat waiting with the broken pieces of her phone in a plastic bag. When she saw her parents, the brave face she'd been wearing all day finally crumbled. "Mom," she whispered, falling into her mother's embrace. "Grandma, is she okay?" "She's stable, baby," Mrs. Williams assured her, stroking her daughter's hair. "Your aunt is with her." Then she turned to Principal Davis, who had emerged from his office. Her voice took on that special tone again, the one that had made her famous in courtrooms across the state. "Now, let's discuss what happened in Miss Thompson's class." The meeting that followed lasted 2 hours. Students lingering in the halls after school could hear raised voices coming from the principal's office. Through the frosted glass, they could see shadows moving back and forth. By the end of the school day, 3 things had happened. Miss Thompson was placed on immediate paid leave, pending an investigation. Jasmine's parents had filed a formal complaint with the school board, and the video of the incident had reached local news stations. As Jasmine left school that day with her parents, she noticed something different. Students she barely knew nodded at her in support. Teachers gave her sympathetic looks. Even the school janitor, Mr. Rodriguez, patted her shoulder as she passed. "This isn't over," her mother said as they walked to the car. "What happened today? It's bigger than just you or your phone, and we're going to make sure it never happens to another student again." Looking back at the school building, Jasmine nodded. She knew tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since her phone shattered, she felt strong. The real story was just beginning. The next morning dawned with dark clouds hanging over Roosevelt High School. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray sky like maple trees. Reporters stood in front of their cameras, talking about disturbing footage and allegations of discrimination. Inside the school's main conference room, Principal Davis sat at the head of a long table, sweating in his blue suit despite the room's cool air. To his left sat 3 members of the school board, their faces serious as they watched the viral video of Miss Thompson smashing Jasmine's phone for the 4th time that morning. "Over 2 million views overnight," said Mrs. Chen, one of the board members, shaking her head. She was Tanya's mother and had been fighting for stricter teacher conduct policies for years. And the comments. People are furious. The school's security officer, Mr. Banks, knocked and entered the room with a thick folder. "You need to see this," he said, placing the folder on the table. "I've been going through our security camera footage from the past year. Ms. Thompson, well, there's a pattern." The videos from the school's security cameras told a disturbing story. Over the past year, Ms. Thompson had confronted 12 students about phone use in class. 9 of those students were Black or Hispanic. In each case, her reaction to white students had been noticeably calmer, usually just a quiet warning. "There's more," Mr. Banks continued, pulling out written complaints from his folder. These were filed by parents over the last 3 years. Most of them were handled quietly. He looked pointedly at Principal Davis, who suddenly found his tie very interesting to look at. Meanwhile, in the school hallways, students were telling their own stories. Maria helped Jasmine set up a simple website where students could share their experiences with Ms. Thompson. By lunchtime, 37 stories had been submitted. Sarah Johnson, a white senior, wrote about how Ms. Thompson had just given her a warning when she answered a call from her dad in class last month. But 2 days later, when Carlos Rodriguez did the same thing, she sent him to detention. In the cafeteria, Marcus played more videos he had secretly recorded over the semester. They showed Ms. Thompson consistently calling on white students who raised their hands while ignoring others, making snide comments about certain students' attitudes, and grading papers with obvious bias. "Look at this," he said, showing Jasmine his English essay from last week. "I wrote about the same topic as Tommy White. We used the same number of sources, similar arguments. He got an A, I got a C-." At 2:00 p.m., Mrs. Williams arrived at the school again, this time with 2 other lawyers from her firm. They carried boxes of documents and laptops. The sight of them walking up the school steps made Principal Davis loosen his collar nervously. "We've been doing our own investigation," Mrs. Williams announced in the conference room. She opened one of the boxes and started laying out papers. "These are complaints about Ms. Thompson from 5 different schools where she taught before coming here. She has a history of this behavior, and it follows a clear pattern." The school board members looked through the documents with growing concern. Miss Thompson had moved from school to school every few years, each time after incidents similar to what happened with Jasmine. But the complaints had always been settled quietly, swept under the rug with small payments and transfers to new districts. "There's something else you should know," Mrs. Williams added, pulling out her tablet. "My daughter wasn't just checking her phone for fun yesterday. She was reading a message about her grandmother in the hospital. While Miss Thompson was destroying her phone, she was cutting off Jasmine's connection to her sick family member." The room fell silent. Even the usually talkative board members had nothing to say. Outside in the hallway, Jasmine sat on a bench, surrounded by supportive friends. Her new temporary phone, bought by her father last night, kept buzzing with messages of support from students at other schools who had seen the video. "You know what's crazy?" she said to Maria. "Yesterday morning, I was just worried about my grandmother. Now look at all this." She gestured to the busy hallway where students were still sharing stories and evidence. Maria squeezed her hand. Sometimes it takes one person standing up to show everyone else they can stand up too. As the afternoon wore on, more parents arrived at the school, many carrying their own folders of complaints and evidence. The small spark of Jasmine's incident had ignited something much bigger. The truth about Ms. Thompson's years of discrimination was finally coming to light, and there would be no more quiet transfers or swept-away complaints. This time, justice would have to be served in the bright light of day. By the end of the week, Roosevelt High School found itself at the center of a storm that nobody could control. Ms. Thompson sat in her empty house, watching her face flash across every local news channel. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from reporters, but she refused to answer any of them. The morning started with a bombshell. A former student named Michael Rodriguez, who had graduated 3 years ago, hosted a video online that changed everything. In the shaky footage from 2021, Ms. Thompson could be clearly heard telling him, "People like you will never succeed in college anyway. Why don't you try something more suitable?" Michael, now a successful sophomore at State University, included his college acceptance letters and current dean's list certificates with the video. "I succeeded despite you, Ms. Thompson, not because of you," he wrote in his post. The video went viral within hours. At the Williams house, Jasmine sat at the kitchen table with her mother, sorting through hundreds of emails from current and former students. Some messages made them cry, others made them angry, but each one added another piece to the puzzle of Ms. Thompson's long history of discrimination. "Look at this one, Mom," Jasmine said, turning her laptop screen. "This girl graduated 5 years ago. Miss Thompson told her she shouldn't apply to Harvard because certain schools have certain standards. She's a resident doctor there now." Mrs. Williams added the email to their growing file of evidence. Her phone rang, another call from the state's Department of Education. They wanted to know why no one had reported these incidents before. Back at school, Principal Davis faced his own problems. More security footage had emerged, showing him dismissing students who came to complain about Ms. Thompson. In one video, he could be seen telling a crying student, "Maybe if you followed the rules better, you wouldn't have these problems." The school board called an emergency meeting at 3 p.m. This time, they gathered in the school gymnasium because so many parents and students wanted to attend. The large room was packed, with people standing along the walls and sitting in the aisles. One by one, students stood up to tell their stories. They talked about unfair grades, harsh punishments, and hurtful comments. Some broke down crying, others spoke with anger, but all of them had proof. Homework assignments, recorded incidents, witnesses. "She gave me a D on my essay about African American literature," said Ashley Thompson, no relation to Ms. Thompson. "When I asked why, she said some people just don't understand sophisticated writing. The next day, my white friend submitted the same essay with just the name changed. She got an A." In the middle of the meeting, breaking news flashed across everyone's phones. A local TV station had discovered that Ms. Thompson had been fired from a private school in another state 10 years ago for similar discriminatory behavior. She had hidden this information when applying to Roosevelt High. The school board members exchanged worried looks. This was bigger than they thought. Not only had they hired someone with a history of discrimination, but they had also ignored years of complaints from students and parents. Jasmine stood up to speak last. The gymnasium fell silent as she walked to the microphone. Unlike the others, she didn't talk about her phone being smashed. Instead, she read from a list of dreams and achievements that Ms. Thompson had tried to crush over the years. Michael Rodriguez, told he couldn't succeed in college, now on the dean's list. Sarah Chen, told to stick to math because English isn't for everyone, now a published writer. James Washington, told he didn't have the right background for AP classes, now heading to Yale. Her voice grew stronger with each name. This isn't about a broken phone anymore. This is about broken trust, broken dreams, and broken spirits. But look at us now. We're not broken. We're standing here, telling our truth. The gymnasium erupted in applause and tears. Parents hugged their children. Students who had felt alone in their struggles found strength in each other's stories. As the meeting ended, the school board announced their decision. Ms. Thompson would face a formal hearing. Principal Davis was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. A full review of all staff conduct policies would begin immediately. Outside the gymnasium, reporters surrounded Jasmine and her mother. But before they could ask any questions, Mrs. Williams held up her hand. "This isn't just about getting justice for one incident," she said firmly. "This is about making sure every student feels safe and respected in their school. And we're just getting started." The Monday morning sun hadn't even risen when national news trucks started rolling into Roosevelt High School's parking lot. What had started as a local story about a smashed phone had grown into something much bigger. Reporters from major networks set up their equipment, waiting to broadcast live for their morning shows. Miss Thompson, who hadn't left her house in days, sat in her living room watching her world crumble on live TV. Her phone buzzed with a message from her lawyer. "Don't talk to anyone. Don't post anything online. The situation is getting worse." She clicked on the morning news just in time to see her own face splash across the screen. The headline read, "XBOSED, Teacher's 15-Year Trail of Discrimination." Her hands shook as she turned up the volume. "Breaking news," the anchor announced. In a shocking development, over 300 former students have come forward with evidence of discriminatory behavior by high school teacher Karen Thompson. But perhaps most disturbing is what our investigation has uncovered about the school systems that kept moving her from district to district. The TV showed clips from Jasmine's incident, followed by interviews with former students from 5 different schools. Each told similar stories: unfair grading, harsh punishments, crushed dreams, and administrators who looked the other way. At the Williams house, Jasmine's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Talk shows wanted her to share her story. Educational organizations wanted her to speak at their events. Civil rights groups offered support and resources. "Baby, you don't have to do any interviews if you don't want to," her mother said, making breakfast. But Jasmine had already made up her mind. "People need to hear the whole story, Mom," she replied. "Not just about my phone, but about everything. About everyone who was hurt before me." At 9 a.m., Jasmine appeared on Good Morning America via video call. She sat in her living room, wearing her favorite blue blazer, looking confident despite her nervousness. The host asked her about the incident, but Jasmine had other plans. "Yes, Ms. Thompson broke my phone," she began, but she tried to break something much more important: our spirit. For years, she told students of color that we weren't good enough, that we didn't belong, that we should aim lower. But look at us now. The camera switched to a split screen, showing successful former students who had overcome Ms. Thompson's discrimination. Doctors, lawyers, writers, engineers, all of them had proved her wrong. By lunchtime, #JusticeForJasmine and #RooseveltStrong were trending nationwide. Students from other schools started sharing their own stories of discrimination, creating a movement much bigger than one teacher or one school. The state's education department called an emergency press conference. "We are launching a full investigation into how Ms. Thompson was able to move from school to school despite numerous complaints," the commissioner announced. "We have failed our students, and that stops today." Meanwhile, at Roosevelt High, something unexpected happened. Students organized a peaceful walkout, but not just to protest Ms. Thompson. They carried signs demanding change in the whole education system. Check teacher history. Equal education for all. No more cover-ups. Listen to students. The local news captured a powerful moment when students from neighboring schools joined the walkout. Hundreds of teenagers, of all races and backgrounds, stood together on Roosevelt High's front lawn, sharing stories and supporting each other. Ms. Thompson finally broke her silence with a written statement delivered by her lawyer. "I apologize for my recent actions regarding the phone incident." But notably, she didn't address any of the other accusations or her long history of discrimination. The statement only made things worse. Social media exploded with angry responses from former students. "She's sorry about the phone, but not about telling me I would never make it to college," posted Michael Rodriguez. His tweet was shared thousands of times. As evening approached, Jasmine sat in her room, looking at all the messages of support on her new phone. She had interviews scheduled for the next 3 days, meetings with education officials, and calls with civil rights lawyers. "Are you okay?" her mother asked, sitting on her bed. "This is a lot to handle." Jasmine showed her mom a message she'd just received from a young girl in California. "Thank you for standing up. Today, for the first time, I stood up to a teacher who was treating me unfairly. You gave me courage." "I'm more than okay, Mom," Jasmine smiled. "This isn't just about getting justice anymore. It's about changing the system. And change is finally happening." Outside, the news vans kept rolling in, their lights illuminating the darkness. Tomorrow would bring more stories, more revelations, and more chances for change. The truth was out, and there was no going back. 1 week after the phone incident, Roosevelt High School looked more like a community center than a school. Students had transformed the gymnasium into what they called the Truth Hub, where hundreds of people gathered to share their experiences of discrimination in schools. Jasmine walked through the gym doors that morning, amazed at what she saw. Large poster boards covered the walls, filled with stories and photos. Students sat in circles on the floor, sharing their experiences. Parents huddled in corners, comparing notes and organizing action plans. "Look who's here," Maria called out, waving Jasmine over to a table where several students worked on laptops. They had created a database to track every reported incident of discrimination in schools across the state. The numbers were shocking. We've received over 1,000 stories in just 1 week, Maria explained, showing Jasmine the spreadsheet. And not just about Ms. Thompson. There are dozens of teachers like her in other schools. At the front of the gym, Mrs. Chen and other parent volunteers had set up a legal help desk. Parents and students lined up to get advice about reporting discrimination and filing formal complaints. 3 civil rights lawyers offered their services for free. Your courage started something big, Mr. Rodriguez, the school janitor, told Jasmine as he set up more chairs. 20 years I've worked here, seeing things like this happen, but nobody ever stood up like you did. Around noon, a group of teachers from Roosevelt High made an unexpected appearance. Led by Mr. Martinez, the Spanish teacher, they carried a large banner that read, "Good teachers stand with good students." "We want you to know," Mr. Martinez announced to the crowded gym, "that not all teachers are like Ms. Thompson. Many of us became teachers to help students grow, not tear them down. We support your fight for justice." His words brought tears to many eyes. Students hugged their favorite teachers, and for the first time, many felt safe sharing their stories with the educators they trusted. The local community showed amazing support too. Restaurant owners sent free food for the volunteers. A printing company donated thousands of flyers and posters. Local churches and community centers offered their spaces for meetings. Even some of Ms. Thompson's former colleagues from other schools came forward. Mrs. Anderson, who had taught with her 5 years ago, brought copies of emails where she had reported Ms. Thompson's behavior to administrators. "They told me to mind my own business," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice shaking. "They said it would cause too much trouble to investigate, so I quit. I couldn't work in a place that allowed such behavior." In the afternoon, something remarkable happened. A group of students from Riverside Prep, the wealthy private school across town, arrived at Roosevelt High. They carried signs and wore T-shirts that read, "Students United Against Discrimination." "We saw what happened to Jasmine," said Emma Parker, their student body president. "And we realized this isn't just about one school or one teacher. This is about making education fair for everyone." The Riverside Prep students shared their own stories. Even at their expensive private school, some teachers treated students differently based on their race or background. The problem, they realized, existed everywhere. By evening, the gym was so full that people spilled out into the hallways. Local TV stations broadcast live from outside the school, showing how a single incident had grown into a powerful movement for change. Mrs. Williams arrived after work, carrying more files and legal documents. But when she saw Jasmine leading a discussion group with students from 5 different schools, she just stood back and smiled proudly. "Your daughter is amazing," a parent told her. "She didn't just fight back against one teacher. She gave all of us the courage to fight for change." Near the end of the day, Jasmine stood on the gym stage with Maria and Marcus. They announced their new plan, a student-led committee to work with school boards on fixing discrimination in schools. Already, 50 students had volunteered to join. When Miss Thompson broke my phone, Jasmine told the crowd, she thought she was showing her power. But real power isn't about hurting people or making them feel small. Real power is what happens when we stand together and demand change. The gym erupted in applause and cheers. Students hugged each other, some crying, others laughing. Teachers shook hands with parents. People who had started the day as strangers ended it as allies in the fight for justice. As the sun set outside Roosevelt High, one thing was clear. Breaking Jasmine's phone hadn't silenced her. It had given her a voice that was now being heard across the nation. And that voice was getting stronger every day. 2 weeks after the phone incident, the State Board of Education called for a special hearing. They chose the largest conference center in the city because hundreds of people planned to attend. The morning of the hearing, the line of people waiting to enter stretched around the block. Miss Thompson sat at a table in the front, wearing a gray suit that seemed too big for her now. She looked smaller somehow, nothing like the intimidating teacher who had terrorized students for years. Her lawyer whispered something in her ear, but she just stared straight ahead. Jasmine and her parents sat at another table, surrounded by their legal team. Behind them, the conference room filled with students, parents, and teachers from across the state. Many wore blue ribbons. The color had become a symbol of their movement against discrimination in schools. This hearing will now come to order, announced Dr. Sarah Martinez, head of the State Board of Education. Today we address not just one incident, but a pattern of behavior that spans 15 years in multiple schools. One by one, students came forward to testify. Michael Rodriguez, now a college student, flew in from State University to share his story. Ashley Thompson showed her unfairly graded essays. Each student brought evidence, recordings, emails, graded papers, witness statements. During a break, reporters interviewed people in the hallway. How did this go on for so long? They asked. The answer was always the same. People in power had chosen to look away. Principal Davis, looking nervous in his wrinkled suit, tried to defend his actions. "We followed proper procedures," he stammered. But when board members showed him dozens of ignored complaints filed by parents, he had no good answer. Then came the biggest surprise of the day. Mrs. Roberts, a former principal from Ms. Thompson's second school, stepped up to testify. She opened an old briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I tried to fire Ms. Thompson 8 years ago," she revealed. "I had evidence of her discrimination against students of color, but the district superintendent told me to transfer her to another school instead. He said firing her would bring bad publicity." The room erupted in angry whispers. Parents held their children closer. Teachers shook their heads in disbelief. When it was Ms. Thompson's turn to speak, everyone expected excuses or denial. Instead, she did something no one saw coming. She broke down. I was wrong," she sobbed. "I've been wrong for years, and let my prejudices control my actions. I hurt so many students, crushed so many dreams." She turned to face the crowd. "I don't expect forgiveness, but you all deserve the truth. Every complaint about me was true." Her confession stunned the room into silence. Some people cried. Others sat in shock. A few shouted angry words about how it was too late for apologies. Finally, it was Jasmine's turn to speak. She walked to the podium carrying not just her broken phone, but also a thick stack of papers. Printouts of messages from students across the country who had faced similar discrimination. "This broken phone represents something bigger," she began. "It represents broken trust, broken dreams, and a broken system. But look around this room. We're not broken anymore. We're strong, we're united, and we're ready for change." She then revealed their proposal, a detailed plan created by students, parents, and supportive teachers. It called for mandatory background checks of teachers' complete employment history, a new system for reporting and investigating discrimination, regular training for teachers and administrators, student representation on school boards, protection for students and teachers who report discrimination. The state board members listened carefully, taking notes. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly as Jasmine explained each point. After 8 hours of testimony, the board reached their decisions. Ms. Thompson's teaching license was permanently revoked. Principal Davis was removed from his position. A full investigation of the district superintendent would begin. All of Jasmine's proposed changes would be implemented statewide. As people left the conference center that evening, they felt different. This wasn't just about punishing one teacher or fixing one school. This was about changing the whole system. Outside, reporters surrounded Jasmine again, but she pointed to the crowd behind her. "This victory belongs to everyone who stood up and spoke out," she said. "But our work isn't finished. This is just the beginning." The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as people hugged, cried, and celebrated. Justice had finally arrived, not with a whisper, but with the powerful voice of unity. 1 year after the phone smashing incident, Roosevelt High School looked very different. Fresh paint brightened the hallways, but the real changes went much deeper. New signs hung everywhere with the school's new motto: "Every student, every dream, every day." Jasmine walked through the front doors, no longer just a student but now the head of the Student Rights Committee. Her broken phone, the one that started it all, sat in a glass case in the main hallway. Below it, a plaque read, "Small actions can create big change." The morning announcements echoed through the speakers, read by both the new principal, Dr. Jackson, and a student representative. This was one of many changes. Students now had a voice in every major school decision. "Today marks 1 year since our school began its journey toward real equality," Dr. Jackson announced. "And what a year it's been. In the teacher's lounge, the wall displayed photographs of the school's transformation. Miss Thompson's empty classroom had become the new student support center, where trained counselors helped students deal with discrimination and other problems. Principal Davis's old office was now the Equal Education Resource Room. Students and teachers could report concerns without fear, and every complaint was taken seriously. The room's walls were covered with success stories of students who had overcome barriers. Maria, now the student body president, ran up to Jasmine with exciting news. "The state just released the numbers," she said, waving a paper. 20 other schools have adopted our anti-discrimination program. It's working, Jasmine. The statistics told an amazing story. In just 1 year, student reporting of discrimination increased by 200%. Every report was properly investigated. Teacher diversity increased by 40%. Student academic performance improved across all groups. College acceptance rates went up for minority students. But the biggest changes were in the everyday things. Students of all backgrounds sat together at lunch. Teachers attended cultural sensitivity training without complaining. The school board now included 2 student members and 3 parent representatives. Around noon, a special assembly gathered in the gymnasium. Students from other schools came to learn about Roosevelt High's transformation. They wanted to create similar changes in their own schools. Jasmine took the stage to share their story. "1 year ago, a teacher broke my phone because she thought she had power over me," she began. "But real power doesn't come from putting others down. It comes from lifting each other up." In the audience sat some familiar faces. Michael Rodriguez, now graduating college with honors, had returned to mentor struggling students. Mrs. Roberts, the brave former principal who testified against Ms. Thompson, now worked with the State Board of Education to prevent discrimination. Even some unexpected allies appeared. Ms. Thompson's replacement, Mr. Carter, was a young teacher who had faced discrimination himself as a student. He worked extra hours helping students believe in themselves. "Remember when we were afraid to raise our hands in class?" Marcus asked during his speech. Now a senior heading to Harvard, he helped create an anonymous reporting system that other schools were copying. The local news came to cover the anniversary. They interviewed students who shared stories not of discrimination, but of support and success. The reporter asked Jasmine what happened to Ms. Thompson. "Last we heard, she's working with civil rights groups, sharing her story as a warning about how prejudice can poison a classroom," Jasmine replied. "She's trying to make amends in her own way." After school, Jasmine's mother visited the Student Support Center. Mrs. Williams no longer needed to fight battles alone. The system itself had changed. She smiled seeing students freely sharing their concerns with caring adults who actually listened. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she told Jasmine. Grandma Williams had recovered from her surgery and now volunteered at the school, sharing wisdom with young students facing challenges. As the day ended, Jasmine stood in front of her old broken phone in its display case. A new student stopped to read the plaque. "Did this really start everything?" the girl asked. Jasmine smiled. "The phone didn't start it. The unfairness had been here for years, but sometimes you need a spark to light the fire of change." Outside, the setting sun painted the sky orange and purple. Students left school chatting and laughing, no longer divided by race or background. Teachers walked alongside them, not as authority figures, but as partners in education. On the front lawn, a new sign stood proud: Roosevelt High School, where every voice matters. Below it, someone had added in small letters, "Thanks, Jasmine." The broken phone had been transformed into something powerful, a reminder that when people stand together against injustice, real change is possible. And at Roosevelt High, that change would last for generations to come.